All right, everybody. Average People Talking Show is back for the first time in months. And I have a lot to talk about tonight. Some exciting things happening, I think. So, wanted to kind of get started by letting everybody know why the long hiatus. I had to move. Had to go through some moments that were challenging in my personal life. Been struggling with my own mental health. Been struggling with financial challenges. I lost a job. It's been pretty crazy. And it just so happens that it seems like the world outside went crazy at the exact same time. I'm switching to it here in a minute, Essie. Hang in there. But as I get this started, I have a new setup and a new recording. We'll call it a recording studio. Really, it's my bedroom. On a new backdrop. So without further ado, boom shakalaka. What do you think? Essie, where are you at? Rick and Morty appropriately behind me. I should shift the camera position so that Rick and Morty are featured ever so slightly. All right. Yeah, there we go. Now we have the Rick and Morty feature. That's good. That's what we want. That makes it a little janky though. As far as when I look over to this screen. Oh, I know how to do it. All right, we move it over here and then we adjust. And then perfect. Now Rick and Morty's featured. Yeah. We got a. It's a little different over here. So, that's why the hiatus. And in the time, I've been thinking about what next to take for the show. Originally, when I wanted to do the show, my idea was to have a lot more guests than I've been able to get on, quite frankly. And part of that is the topics I touch and the level I go to them. I have this problem in my personal life, too, where a lot of times I want to talk about things on a deeper level than most people really want to get into. Oh my gosh, that's terrible. Friend of the show, Essie, got in a car wreck and is now medicated. I hope you're okay. You should talk to me later. But yeah, I've been wanting to figure out a new, fresh way to do this. And if I'm going to do a lot of solo episodes, I've been trying to figure out timing. I've been trying to figure out what it is that I have of value to talk about. And what I landed on was this series, Changed My Mind. And yes, I'm a little bit poking fun at a famous YouTube personality who I'm not going to give the pleasure of mentioning by name. I'm just kidding, I will. It's Steven Crowder and his Change My Mind desk, right? He would show up to college campuses, talk conservative nonsense, and do the whole change my mind smugly with the mug. Well, this, with my daughter's autism cup, this has changed my mind. This is giving credit to what it takes to change your mind on a major topic, something complex. And so these episodes will have kind of a little bit of a formula to them. But it's me, so they won't be formulaic. They will be good, I promise. They won't suck. And those are different things. But kind of what it's going to do is I'm going to talk about what my position was when I grew up. And then kind of the when, why, what, how it changed. And then finally how my opinion has evolved since it began to change. What I think now, what I think are the most salient arguments for what I currently believe, and what people are missing. And so in the first part, I'm going to talk about what arguments I used to say, and there's going to be kind of, with the absence of somebody who still believes that way to come be on my show, most people, most of you in the audience don't know someone who went from being a diehard Christian who believed in young earth creationism and conservative values to the core. Earth is only 8 to 10,000 years old. Noah's Ark's a real story. And pro-life, all the expected positions you would come with that. Pro-gun, typical Republican values, to go flip all the way the other direction where, I'm an outspoken atheist. I no longer have faith of any kind. I am very staunchly pro-choice. I have flipped on almost everything from economics to social issues to... It's hard to overstate how much I've completely changed my mind on. I mean, really. It's been almost every major issue that people care about today. And so I thought about taking the hottest ones, and what hotter one to talk about tonight than abortion. So without any more explanation, that's what the new series is going to be. I hope to put this out at least bi-weekly, but I really, with what's going on with me, I can't commit to anything. I just think it will be a good series to record and put out there, and I really hope that this content is found to be enjoyable. And as always with previous shows, if people want to come in and live chat and, pick my brain in the moment and ask questions, I love that. It actually adds a lot to the show, and I really appreciate it when you guys do that in the chat. And you can live chat with me on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitch. I stream live on all three. If you're here, shout me out, say hello, and that's the new idea. And it's not an accident that the last video 3 months ago was, "Are you truly open-minded?" Because I'm going to challenge that and see just how far you're willing to be moved on your positions. It sort of flows from where my thinking was 3 months ago. So tonight's topic was abortion. As I already said, I grew up, I was super pro-life. And when I say super pro-life, in terms of importance, value of where pro-life was and issues, Essie's in the chat, I'm sure she can confirm this. When you're in Christian circles, that's probably top 3 or top 2 for every single person at your church. It's like the number one issue. It gets talked about in sermons at church. Pro-life is the most important thing for evangelical Christians right now in today's world. They feel that this is one of the issues that they need to correct. The wrong in the universe that needs righting the soonest, the fastest. It's the most important to fix ASAP. So that is interesting because recently we had this change to Roe v. Wade. It's been overturned. All these new laws are going into effect in various states. That's really impactful, I think, in terms of what we can really figure out going forward. I mean, it's really... We're going to have a better conversation about this. That's what I would say. It's like we can't keep talking about it the same way. And I talked about the hero-villain narrative, right? Either side of this, John, you think you're a hero, you think the other guy's a villain. That doesn't work. There are real ideas that people are contending with. It's just that everyone's not very good at talking about them, and no one knows what actually changes anyone's mind. And so people say, well, if someone believes that, there's no way you're changing their mind. I actually think a pro-life person, there is a pathway, and there is an argument that they could make that could move a pro-choice person to their view. I think that there are better arguments on the pro-choice side, which is why that's what I fall on now, and we're going to get into that tonight. But I think that people could be moved. It's very clear that the importance level for most people, regardless of whether they're on either side of this, it's very high. Sadly, pro-choice men is not high. And one of the things I want to point out tonight is part of the problem is 95% of the people who talk about this and argue about this, even the ones that are on your side if you're pro-choice, I actually think the fact that pro-choice men have kind of been almost discouraged to even participate in the debate at times because this is about so-called women's choice, that has actually hurt the overall cause of changing the hearts and minds of people. And I hope to demonstrate that. Because the pro-life men feel like they're fighting a holy crusade and winning, especially now with Roe being overturned. So we need everyone that supports our cause. It doesn't matter what your gender is. It doesn't matter what your biology is. Good arguments stand on their own 2 feet, and when you make them, they're convincing. That is the test of a good argument. So, yeah, for me, it was no different. One of the top 3 issues in my household growing up, pro-life, we would have events about the issue. We would have rallies. We would have merchandise even. My church had merchandise, if you can believe that. Christians in the chat know what I'm talking about. It was a really big deal, and I bought into that completely. I also was known as kind of like the young scholar, the up-and-coming, soon-to-be pastor. Chris, what's up, dog? That's dude. Thanks for coming. Even if you stay only for a little bit, I'm glad that you decided to pop on and say hi. What's up, Chris? So, yeah, thank you, Micah, for the audio check. Appreciate it. Sorry, babe. I'm about to get yelled at in Twitch chat. If you guys aren't on Twitch, she's about to be like, how dare you call me by my name and not babe? So, I'm growing up. I'm super pro-life. And because I was like the young scholar, the up-and-coming soon-to-be pastor, you'd laugh, but I was really good at arguing this. I was really good at debating this. And I made convincing points. And there were multiple points where I would make people go, I don't really have an answer for that. And you weren't really moving people, I don't think, ever from pro-choice to pro-life, but I certainly made them realize that I knew more about what I was talking about than the average bear. What was those arguments? Well, the first one, and it was probably my favorite one, it evolved over the time, so I'm probably only giving the most recent version of it I remember, but I call it the eventuality argument. And what the eventuality argument is essentially the... it was my way around the science argument, because I knew that pro-life couldn't win on that. And so I would tell people, you can't science your way out of a moral issue. This is a moral issue, and you know it's wrong. You know it's wrong intrinsically, and here's why you know it's wrong. Because let's say, the one of the comparisons I would use is, let's say you drove around in your truck and did donuts in a tree farmer's field. And you destroyed all his tree farm seeds. And you wrecked all of that to the point where none of those are usable. The whole field is wrecked for the season. And they had just started to grow, right? Moisture had just hit the seeds. They just started to grow. And they catch you, so this farmer decides he wants damages, right? He sues you for damages. Is he suing you for what it costs to put the seeds in the ground? Well, no, that wouldn't fully compensate him, right? He would be suing you for what those seeds would eventually become and the revenue lost from what his expected tree sales would be. Certainly you understand that events in the future are caused by events in the past. You had sex. That thing, you can science into all these different beliefs and opinions that you want, but you know that act created a life. So you can pretend all you want that you're doing this thing where you're being, justifying your abortion, but pretending that you don't know what the eventual outcome of that is a full human lifetime, right? It's very easy from the standpoint of, well, it's not a human right now because it's a zygote or an embryo or a whatever. And but looking back, no one looks at a 60-year-old person with a full life full of experience and color and wonder and awe and successes and failures and suffering and joy, and goes, my life, I didn't start at until I was born. We are fully aware and fully cognizant of the fact that we started from the moment our parents had sex, and that's the beginning of our story. And we recognize that that's how that happens. And we're kidding ourselves if we don't. That was the eventuality argument. It's eventually going to be a person. And so pretending that zygote is not going to become a person is intellectually dishonest. I think it's a more advanced argument than what most of the time you see in the pro-life circles. And you can tell me if you agree in the chat. I don't think most of the arguments pro-lifers tend to make are very convincing. I'm going to switch on my screen real quick just for a second, just to point out what I'm talking about. And you guys are going to see picture in picture like crazy for a second. But look at this. Here's a perfect example. These are a bunch of pro-life arguments on this website, and I'll scroll up to some of the ones that they think are really good. Unless you're going to take care of the baby, you cannot be against abortions. And then they counter-argue with, quick answer, the statement would be similar to asking, are you against pedophilia? If so, how many molested boys have you adopted? I can't even begin to tell you how many logical fallacies are wrapped up into this, but it's more than 3 and less than 7. It's just it's ridiculous. You can't force a woman to be pregnant. The pro-life position is like compulsory pregnancy. No one is forcing anyone. The woman's already pregnant. Well, this just ignores the fact that there is an option to not be pregnant anymore. Like, this is just not dealing in good faith with the arguments that are being presented. And that's why I wanted to show that, because, quite frankly, that is most of the arguments on both sides. Would you agree? I mean, most of the arguments on both sides of this debate are just saying words that don't follow from what the person across the aisle said to you. And because of that, they don't land. So many of the arguments just didn't land with me when I was pro-life. Like, hey, look, it's just an embryo, bro. Like, no, it's more than that, because it's clearly going to become an amazing full human life with a story. It's a woman's choice. Well, no woman has the right to choose to murder someone, even if it's their baby, and this is clearly murder. So I didn't agree with that one. There was always the argument of, you only care about babies while they're in the womb. What are you going to do to take care of this thing? Like, what if the mother can't take care of the baby? And those arguments just didn't land with me. The one that most especially never landed with me was men don't have a say. Like, I thought murder was murder and morality was morality, and my gender should have no impact on what's right and wrong. Like, the argument for right and wrong should stand on its own. And that's correct. However, if you think about it, in the last 6 months, I guarantee you've had some version from your pro-choice friends of any of those arguments. It's women's rights. The pro-life people only care about babies while they're in the womb and don't care about taking them after the fact. This is healthcare. Notice that none of those arguments deal with personhood, which is what the argument is actually about. And I've talked about this previously in previous episodes, but that's why they're not convincing. You have someone on the other side of you who's saying, I think that's a person, and I think it's wrong to kill persons. They might use different language, but that's fundamentally what their belief comes down to. They're saying person is a moral term. It's a philosophical term of someone that is in our moral community, i.e. someone who is worthy of our moral consideration. That's what it means to be a person, and they think it's a person from conception. So then you hit them back with all these other arguments that are just at that point truly irrelevant. And no matter how much you get told it's irrelevant, no matter how much it doesn't convince anyone, no matter how much you can't look back and think you've ever changed anyone's mind with those arguments, people on the left and people on the pro-choice side of this continue to make them. Not only is it intellectually dishonest, frustrating, it's bad faith to your interlocutor who disagrees with you and is also trying to make the world a better place. Because if they're right, it would be making the world a better place to stop all this murder going on. And if you're right, it would be making the world a better place to allow women to do this without restrictions. So, it really matters. And it's a moral debate. It's a moral dilemma, which makes it fundamentally philosophical. You can't science your way out of a moral argument. That was my bread and butter when I was pro-life. And I would use that eventuality argument. And I would even sometimes bring up how people would feel guilty, how a prior action made something happen at a later action, right? That cause and effect thing. And shown just because you can't see the consequences of the baby never having to live a full life doesn't mean that you're not guilty of preventing it. And I was pretty good at this. Until I wasn't. Until I ran into actual contradictions in my own thinking that I didn't understand. I thought that argument was really convincing. But I realized later on it wasn't consistent. So why? Why did I realize that? What triggered this? Well, I think there are different change triggers for everybody. The first thing that happened was I started to doubt the existence of souls and anything supernatural. So one thing I didn't talk about earlier is even though those were the arguments I used for other people, this is the trick, and this is what's so tricky about discussing this. It wasn't what I actually thought, and I wouldn't tell people what I actually thought because it was frustrating to have that conversation. Because what I actually thought was human souls were real, and human souls go to heaven, and the zygote is where the soul shows up. It would be very hard to get me to admit that, because then you would start to challenge my faith. I would get defensive. I would shut down. Didn't want to talk about it. Didn't want to talk about souls. Now, later in life, when I first started to doubt the existence of the soul and wasn't really sure if souls existed, that moment, that trigger where I was doubting anything supernatural, I didn't buy into any supernatural claims, that really for me did move something. It made me start to go, maybe this is one such issue I should re-examine. Now, in addition to doubting the existence of souls, mostly quietly to myself as I was researching and listening to things, I did have life events happen, and this is often a trigger for people for changing their minds, is they sometimes have to have a life event to change their mind. But I don't actually think it's the life event that causes it. I think what life events do is they put things into conflict that you were able to easily ignore before. You still with me, chat? Who's out there? We hanging out? I haven't seen any comments come through in a while, so. Here's what I mean. No worries, Essie. Have a good night. Here's what I mean. I got involved in a long-term relationship with a person who had the pro-choice view, and I didn't know that until I was very heavily invested in the relationship and wasn't about to sacrifice it over what I thought. And this is in my mid-20s before I've really changed my mind. That does change things. If someone you love, who you believe is this moral, good person, wants to do good in the world, that could be the first person that you deal with in good faith that you don't see as an evil monster. And they simply now just have a different opinion than you. And so what I want to suggest to anybody watching this is you can skip that step for every single person you're talking to that disagrees with you on this and just go straight to, hey, let's deal with people in good faith. If they have that position, they must have good reasons for thinking that they're correct. They're terribly confused, and their confusion is causing a lot of suffering. And so let's have the conversation, because one of us must be right. It doesn't have to be evil and good. Telling yourself that story gets us nowhere. It gets us closer to violence and away from understanding. It gets us away from the conversation that we need to have. So what happens is I have this life event. I'm in this relationship with a person who is now my wife, who everybody probably knows on the show. And Micah's pro-choice. She has her reasons. I make my usual line of arguments that I feel are really, really strong. And I've been making them my entire life at this point. And I hurt her feelings. And then I feel bad for that. And then that starts to leave me with questions about my values and how I weigh them. And I'm also starting to questioning this soul issue too. And so I'm in this flux where I have some other positions that are changing that are kind of linked. I have questions that I can't answer. I have some life events, like, you know, friends that were going through something, getting older, getting, you know, in a long-term relationship with someone whose opinion I value, and I'm dealing with them in good faith. And she started making good points about, you know, what this impact is to somebody, and that I'm wrong about what that fetus is in the womb. And I couldn't understand. Now, that next piece that I couldn't understand, I want everybody to take a really good look at the inside themselves. Never say that. Never say that. Never deny somebody else the ability to understand someone else's experience. There's a difference between understanding someone's experience and feeling their experience. And understanding it is important. We all try to do it. That's the whole point of stories. The point of a story is you tell the story and I understand what the experience of that story was. I can't ever feel it like you felt it, but I can understand it. And we are simply apes that tell stories, and some of those are of the moral quality. Stories about right and wrong, stories about what we should do and what our duties are. And that actually triggered me being determined to understand it more from her perspective. But I kind of did that in the shadows until I had changed my mind. And it was probably a few months to a year after we had our first conversation. And then I never really talked about it again, because at this point in my life, due to my other changing views and what I had going on, it had dropped quite a bit in the priority level. It just wasn't as big of a deal to me. And I was harping on we got to stop all this murder, because quite frankly, I just started to realize all the bigger problems that causes much more human suffering in the world. And so the first position I moved to was, I'm not sure anymore. I don't know. And so I don't really have a position. And because I don't know, I shouldn't have a say. It's not because I'm a male. It's because I don't know for sure that I knew what I was talking about. That was kind of where I landed. Now, here I am 5 years later, 6 years later, 7 years later, something like that. That is entirely different than what my position is today. I'm very sure I know what I'm talking about. And I've moved a lot further along from, hey, we're probably wrong to do it, but we need to have a convincing argument that everybody can use that starts to move the majority position before we use authoritarian state force to impose our will on others. So it was actually where I changed to was, because we're not sure, the state should not use its power to enforce it. And so it was more of like a legal opinion, but I didn't think further about the actual moral dimension, which is ultimately what the debate about abortion is. It's a moral question. And I'm going to get to that here shortly. But I think it's interesting to notice how much time can pass. So I'm pro-life my whole teenage years, and I talk about it. I give, I don't know, sermons about it at youth group even, maybe. Talked about it all the time, doing these events. I'm like, gotta save the babies, man. And then from there, it takes 10 years before I move even slightly off to maybe I'm wrong. Like, it took me 10 years to consider that maybe I was wrong. That's another lesson for the pro-choice in the crowd. It takes a long time to sow the seeds of doubt. And the people who actually did that for me were people I was in a close relationship with, that I valued, that had the patience with me, that didn't talk down to me, that didn't treat me like an evil other, that gave me the good faith consideration that I was trying to do good in the world with my position, and dealt with me with respect and kindness. Sarah, who's been on the show, was one of those people. The people who chastised me, tell me I was trying to deny the rights of women, like, who, when you argue this way and you tell people they have intentions they do not have, that hurts your position, and it hurts the conversation. It starts that pathway down bad faith, where, hey, Chet, good to see you. Much love. It starts this bad faith problem where you're no longer dealing with the ideas and the arguments. You're now not even giving the room for that change to occur, because you're trying to ascribe intentions to somebody that they did not have. And that feels bad, so then I get defensive. And then people would be like, ooh, look, you're defensive. That proves I'm right. No, it proves you're a dick. If somebody gets defensive and you're having this conversation with your interlocutor, like, maybe it proves you're right, but that's in a tiny fraction of the cases. Sometimes when you have somebody on the ropes, it might prove that you're right to who? Your other people that already agree with you? Does that really solve anything? Does that make the world a better place? Does that move people towards the position that we want them to go? Probably not. Probably not. We don't want people to get defensive. We want them to be open-minded to change. And we want them to be able to change their position on things that matter. And to do that, no one who's defensive can be in a mindset to do that, which is part of why it probably took me 10 years. Because, I mean, for years and years of that 10 years, every time this conversation came up, I was probably spending most of it on defense, being defensive, because people were accusing of me of being a heinous asshole instead of giving me credit for trying to do the good. And I would actually say that. I'd be like, dude, I'm just trying to save babies, man. Like, just let me save the babies. I thought I was being a hero. I thought I was being a crusader. That's really important, I think, to note. What's fascinating, I think, now is you look all the way back as my thinking has evolved and updated and what's gone on, and look at the room that's able to happen when you do have space to have good faith, honest conversation with people who disagree with you. Because now, now I'm in a situation where I think it's really not morally wrong to have an abortion basically at any point up and until birth. I would say it's less preferable to using contraceptives ahead of time, and only that. My good old friend Tugboat, aka Robert, says in chat, on that note, you should not attach motives to people who have them, i.e., you're trying to or denying the rights of women. You make the claim that this is bad because these people don't feel that they have that motivation. But how do we address the fact that they are indeed doing that? Great question. I'm getting there. There's a difference. This is exactly like how we teach conflict resolution in therapy and having good conversations, is we never want to use you and what you're doing and blaming words and those kinds of things. And trying to do that. It's always what the situation is, what ultimately the impact of that behavior is, and what the result is. But I want to point out that that does not work when I'm coming back at you with, okay, but the actual situation is your ignorance or desire to ignore the problem is actually causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent babies. So you're at a pure stalemate at that point. I hope that's clear, right? Like, there's no way out of that until we figure out what the heck we're talking about. And that is the problem, is I think people on both sides of the argument, when they make it about women's rights, quite frankly, if that's your core argument and you're on the left, you don't know what you're talking about. Because this issue fundamentally cannot be about women's rights. If it's about women's rights, that assumes that the personhood part of the disagreement has already been solved. And I promise you that if you're talking about that and you're talking to a pro-life person, it's not, because the personhood thing is what actually changes their mind, which is the point of my third part of this, is the evolution of the belief. Eventually down the road, the reason I came to believe that it's not morally wrong to abort at any point is because the best argument for my current view, and really the only effective one, talks about personhood. It keeps its eye on the ball regarding personhood, and it talks about nothing else other than personhood. It doesn't talk about women's rights. It doesn't talk about science. Because the truth is we're talking about a moral issue. We're talking about is, when is it wrong to murder? And you would say always. Okay? Agreed. We at least have that. All right? What is murder? Murder is the unjust taking of another life of a human being. Okay. What is meant by human being? Person is implied in being. And we play a language game a lot of times when we debate this. And I did this all the time as a pro-life person. I was playing a language game. On the one side, I was using life as a stand-in for person. I was using being to mean, or I would argue that being is just any human thing, right? You know what a being is. The zygote's a human being, obviously. And I would play this language game where I didn't ever actually have to define or explain personhood. Personhood, i.e. the being part of human being, is where the debate actually is. Human just means a thing that has human DNA. It could be a person, it could be an arm, it could be a leg, it could be your fingernail, it could be dead, it could be alive, it doesn't matter, it's human. But a lot of times people say, you know what a human is. And what they mean is, you can recognize what a human person is, right? Because they can't imagine what a human non-person would be. And as a pro-life person, I couldn't. I didn't know what that would be. It's very easy to imagine non-human persons. Superman, we feel like should be a person. He should be in our moral community. He should be worthy of moral consideration. He's an alien, right? But if I murder him, he seems to have something about him where I would be in the wrong if I just murder him. You would have a problem with me just killing Superman for no reason. Now, he's not human. He's an alien. He's Kryptonian. Data from Star Trek, or other AI robots like him, if you're not familiar with Data. We seem to have this thing where we think they are persons, even though they're not human. It's the other side that's actually really hard to imagine, is what does it mean to be a non-person human? Well, even the question itself is a trick. Because what does it mean to be is actually the whole question. Philosophical moment. But you have to get there. Because the moment you say to be, you kind of pull up by the bootstraps of philosophical inference the idea of being, which is consciousness, sentience, to be, to exist, to be recognized. And there are these things here that there's these qualities that we think of that one must have to be a person, and we intuit them, and we're really bad at using language to talk about it. And so, Robert, if you're still here, I know this is kind of a really long, winding answer to what you were talking about, But the reason that I don't want to address at all whether or not someone is taking away the rights of women, because effectively they are, sure, but that's not where they're at. And if they simply would move on the position of personhood, well, then we start the important process of getting off of the stuck point that we couldn't agree on before, that they were insisting on is where they're at. And we start the process. Now, it may take them 5, 10, 15 years from there to eventually change their mind all the way around to, yes, this should be changed in the law. Okay. But you're not changing anyone's mind tomorrow with the women's rights argument. Like, it's not effective. It's clearly not working. The numbers on this have only changed in the recent generation, I would argue, because we are the least religious of the generation that we've ever had coming up. And that's just luck. And I don't want to rely on luck. I think good arguments don't rely on luck. They rely on being convincing and making good points and actually dealing with your interlocutor in good faith. That's how good disagreements are solved. And if you think about it, that's how you solve any disagreement in your personal life. It's how you just solve any disagreement, period. So there's all these ineffective arguments for what I used to think that people throw out there that just doesn't work. I wasn't going to be convinced by the women's rights thing. I wasn't going to be convinced by, oh, men shouldn't have a say, and it's just an embryo, and you don't know what you're talking about. Because when you say it's just an embryo, I'm like, sure, scientifically that's just an embryo, but it's a person. It's a human being. That's what I was saying, without admitting that I was talking about persons, without knowing anything about personhood. So this comes back to my key criticism of the left. 95% of my friends on the left don't even know what their own criteria for what it constitutes to be a person is. The personhood thing comes down to one fundamental question. And this is why I think this is the best argument for my current view, and I'll present it here, and you can tell me if you think it's salient. I believe in a gradient theory of personhood that criteria includes sentience, social standing, and consciousness, the ability to suffer, right? And it's a gradient. So in other words, maybe some things have more or less personhood, and it's not just an on-off switch. I think that's really important. Fred jumped in. I will come back to that point in a second. I just want to catch up with what Fred's comment was. I just joined you here, so perhaps you've already covered it, in which case I apologize. Are there places we can reach agreement? If we're opposed to abortion, maybe we can make condoms and birth control free and easily accessible. That would reduce the need for one. Can we agree comprehensive sex education could be free and easily accessible? This will also reduce the need for abortion. Finally, can we agree that a pregnant person should have all the resources necessary for the healthiest pregnancy? Further, can we provide the resources to raise this child, decent place to live? If we can't agree on those things, I would question whether we are interested in reducing abortion. So here's the problem. When you take that line of reasoning, why it wasn't convincing to me when I was pro-life is because when I was pro-life, I also had I also had this position of, I would say, rugged laissez-faire capitalism, which kind of goes in the soup with a lot of other of these beliefs, where it's like people need to take responsibility for their own actions and pull themselves up by their bootstraps. If they can't figure out how to cobble together the resources, maybe they should have thought about that before they made these choices. It's a very free will, like, nailing you to a cross thing. And so this is the pro-life from the religious take, right? Not from that really good intellectual argument I made at the beginning of the episode, which you weren't here for. But essentially, I used to make the eventuality argument, which was, you know what the eventual life looks like, and so you're just being intellectually dishonest if you pretend not to know what that zygote is going to turn into. That was more of my secular argument to deal with people who wanted me to take the religious stuff out. But when you're actually engaging with the majority of people who are pro-life, which is extremely religious, they believe in this sense of rugged personal responsibility, which is also why the women's rights thing doesn't really work for them typically either. It's because secretly we believe in souls, and we think that there's a moment where you start your soul's journey, right? And that's really what we mean by personhood. Well, but this is a case of, I would say, curbing other people's behavior. And that is actually, I mean, that's the whole point of the pro-life argument, is this is a moral failing of society. It requires laws and intervention to get people not to do it. So that is what they're interested in. That is the whole point of being pro-life. So you can make that argument. I can just tell you that when I was pro-life, it wasn't convincing. So you can make it all you want. You know, maybe you've convinced a few people, but I'll explain why the personhood argument was so convincing to me. And this is what really challenged me and what started to get me to move. Because I was not a person who was... I mean, I didn't start to really be staunch pro-choice until probably 3-4 years ago. I didn't start to argue for it in any kind of serious way until fairly recently. I just want to catch up with Chet since he's going to challenge us ahead of time. I want to see if I nail it. Not to be contrarian, but I don't really believe personhood is a great concept either. I'd rather find other language in the meantime, using personhood in whatever way maximizes our well-being. So our well-being, who's our? Our has to relate to something, and this is my point. Well, because if they play the soul card, a lot of times secular people, Robert. So Robert said, additional question. You say secret belief about souls. Why is it so secret? When you bring up souls, a lot of times the secular people who are like, well, souls is a religious thing, or that's not really scientific, and we can't make our laws based on souls. And so then it just, that's a good point, and it's a true point. But so then, even though it's informing my moral belief, I can't hold that as a legal standard. So I find a different place to move while actually protecting that secret belief, if that makes sense. That's how I used to think. I didn't think through that process consciously when I was pro-life, but I mean, that's essentially what I was doing without knowing I was doing it. So this is a great conversation, and I'm glad you guys are bringing up these points. But I want to explain why I do think personhood is the argument. Is whenever we talk about what it is to be, and we sneak that in, whether it's soul or human being or human, sometimes people just say human, life, usually when somebody says life, they actually mean a person. Sometimes they say individual. This is a common argument. In fact, let me share my screen. This was one I was going to bring up because it's what a pro-lifer feels is their most convincing argument. And so I think you have to meet them there, where what they feel like is the most convincing and the thing they're the most sure of, right? So if I pop this on, this is from a pro-life website. Down here, they have this little fun story. This is welcometotruth.com, which I love the aggression of the website title. It's amazing. Let me end here with a story. Once upon a time, there was a small brick schoolhouse that was going to be completely demolished because the principal and mayor agreed that they didn't want it there anymore. Townspeople stood around waiting for the dynamite to be lit, murmurs, blah, blah, blah. Essentially, the story is this nice old woman who is referred to in the story as a seamstress. My God, this website is so sexist. Anywho, the old seamstress says, "Are you sure there's no children in that school?" And the guy says, "No one knows. That's above my pay grade." What? You're going to blow up a school whether or not you know for sure there is no life in it? It's the principal's decision, his school, his choice. And so they're trying to draw this analogous situation, but this is very revealing of the pro-life, ultra-religious mindset. And there's scripture quoted all over throughout this website. They're basically saying isn't this insane? If somebody did this in real life, wouldn't we want to make absolutely certain that there's no life, quote unquote life, inside the building? Well, there's probably tons of life inside the building. I'm going to guess insects and, other living organisms, bacteria and viruses and all those things. Because clearly what they mean is not life. They mean person. And a life is different. Categorically, wholly, incredibly different than person. Life can explain tons of things, but nobody... Yeah, the bad web design is bad. Yes, all of us tech people can shudder in fear at this super pro-life website. But it's actually a really popular one, which makes it even funnier, I think. They're trying to play this gotcha game where they use ambiguous language. It's the classic ambiguity fallacy, right? And they want to change the definition of language. So I was recently in an abortion debate group, just for another example, and this is what people are missing. And no matter how much I tried to hold someone's feet to this fire of, hey, you're not defining person here. You're saying human being, but you haven't made it clear what that means. What qualities? You don't even need the word personhood. You can just say, what qualities does one need to have to be a human being? And that person will say, these were the questions I could not answer. These are the questions that started changing my mind. And that person will start to say, well, human DNA. Okay, well, your fingernails that you cut off yesterday have human DNA. You're not murdering your fingernails, are you? Well, okay, no, I'm not murdering my fingernails. You're just being difficult. No, I'm just trying to understand exactly what qualities. So human DNA is one. I can get behind that. I think that leaves out some other important beings that we might want to morally include, right? Like, I think we should have some moral protections for non-human animals that we seem to have moral consideration for, like puppies. But we can leave that aside for now, because I agree with you. Humans are probably the most important one we need to protect for our own species' sake. So let's start there. What exactly constitutes a human being? Like, what qualities specifically make the difference between just human cells and a human being? Like, when do the cells have being? When is there a it there? Because eventually that person, if you hold them to trying to come up with an answer to that question, the ultimate one that I came up with, well, clearly it must have something to do with consciousness. And that's the first step towards recognizing that a fetus maybe isn't a person from the moment of zygote. That critical first step is the conversation we're not having. And it's why it's a conversation that's not about women's rights, even if that's the consequence at the end of the chain. And I agree with that consequence. It's a reason why I even have any feelings about this view at all. But that's not what the disagreement is about. And those are two very different things. I don't disagree about the consequences. I disagree about the action, the moral action. Fred says, I don't think most of us are concerned about saving the life of bacteria. If you could show me a sentient bacteria. Right, so you, Fred, you have decided that sentience is a key component of personhood. You might not have put it into those words, but you feel like that's part of why I care about certain things and not other things, is because I care about sentient beings, right? You might not call that personhood, but it is an argument about personhood. I really encourage everyone, if you're lost with me a little bit at this moment, Crash Course Philosophy, it's one of the best channels on YouTube. All 47, I think, of their videos are phenomenal. It gives overviews on some really important issues. But they have an episode on personhood. It really explains why this touches everything we care about and how much the language we use is kind of confused. Because when I'm saying I'm trying to save a life, what I mean is I'm trying to save the life of a person. The person is implied. Just like when you say, I don't care about the life of a bacteria, but I do, but if you could find me a sentient bacteria, you're saying if you could find me a bacteria person, a person who happened to be a bacteria. Just like we're trying to not get somebody not to worry about human organisms that happen to not be persons. And if you think about it, that's important for the death penalty. That's important for what you think about this is important for abortion. It's important for euthanasia. It's important for assisted suicide. It's important for like all these issues. Like, we have to understand what we mean by personhood. In the philosophy dimension, it's an incredibly important concept. And it's a little bit contested. There are 6 major theories, I would say, what we call the personhood criterias that people use. One of them is the social criteria. One of them is the human criteria. One of them is the sentience criteria, which has been put forward. Fred, essentially what your argument is more or less Peter Singer's. And he goes through at length in Animal Liberation that he wrote back in the late 60s. That we really should give equal personhood to all sentient beings and no personhood to non-sentient beings. And I don't know if I'm fully there, because what I tend to ascribe to is the gradient theory of personhood, that beings have more or less personhood at different points, depending on all the criteria that we just mentioned. The social one, does anyone recognize them as a person? So here's a thought experiment just to kind of bring this concept to a close, and a really difficult question, I think, for anybody who's pro-life to answer. Okay, you say human DNA is the key. Let's say a really smart scientist went to a far-off island and was doing work in secret, and somehow figured out how to create a robot. A mechanical robot, but the robot is constructed entirely of human DNA. Now, the robot is not sentient. The robot is not conscious, but it walks, talks, and has functions that have been programmed into it through an algorithm. So it seems very person-like, but it does not have sentience. And it's made of human DNA. Well, the other thing about it being on an island is important because no one cares about this robot. The scientist died, left the robot there. We show up later. Maybe we need the robot for us as persons. Maybe it has something that we need. Can we kill it without being guilty of murder? Well, I didn't make any conscious creature suffer. I didn't end the life of a sentient being. I didn't destroy anything that anyone cared about. Therefore, I have not killed a person. So I think, have it at ya. Really, I feel like the personhood is a gradient between those 3 things. And here's why. And here's why I think this argument is so convincing from my point of view, is it includes almost every being we could think of that we want to care about. Part of why Superman's clearly a person to us is because when he shows up to Earth, yeah, he's not human, but he's clearly sentient, he's clearly conscious. He immediately becomes a part of our social group as Clark Kent. And so there are people who care about him and have consideration for him. And, yeah, I all of a sudden don't care about where he came from, where it is. If somebody kills him for no reason, that's wrong. It allows us to care for future AIs we might invent that could be like Data from Star Trek. You know, sure, they don't have human DNA, but they clearly have the sentience and the consciousness and the ability to suffer and the social consideration. This is actually why you cry when Data dies. And not just because Nemesis was a terrible movie. Sorry for the non-Trekkies in the audience. Doesn't this force the question of what it takes to be sentient? Is Commander Data sentient? Yes, it does. And it does force that question philosophically. And I hate to break this to people, but I don't think it's quite answered. I really don't. And this is why it's frustrating to me when people on the left act so high and mighty on their high horse when it comes to the abortion issue. They're so sure of themselves. They're so sure they have a clue what they're talking about. And they're very confident, and they're very convincing, and they're very animated about it. And that's a good indication that you don't know what you're talking about, that there's more to it than that, and that you should slow down and respect some outside views. Now, because we can't know for sure what it takes to be sentient, we can go off of the majority of the evidence that we have now and make the best guess and be careful. Right, Fred? That's the key. Be careful. It does seem like, from neuroscience, that consciousness and sentience definitely seems to have something to do with certain parts of our brain. So, by viewing human brains in a MRI scanner, and we can light up those parts of the brain, we can also know when those parts of brains are developed during pregnancy, right? So we can have at least a pretty good, reasonable estimation that seems to be at least one part. I might not be able to explain how or why that happens, but I know that every single time I destroy that part of the brain, it seems like the conscious being inside it dies, or is no longer able to communicate if it is still alive in any reasonable way, no matter what we try, and is unable to be re-stimulated or re-emerged in any way. And I also know that no being I've ever seen grow seems to have this before that moment of brain development is reached. And if you see that enough times, it leaves you feeling pretty confident that clearly sentience has something to do with complexity at the level of the brain. So if that's our best guess, and it seems like it's a pretty good one, let's go with it for now, but not be so confident that we know everything. And let's be cautious. This is why I tend to think that the viability time frame is not actually that good, the original Roe framework. I really like 15 weeks, and then after that, you know what, let's only maybe do this in the case of you know, a threat to the life of the mother. And I don't think that threat has to be an immediate fatal threat. But that's only a moral prescription. Because we don't know, we should not force it. We cannot force entire populations of people to do something democratically because we think maybe there's a problem, right? So ultimately, that's why I said my position now, which I think is the correct one, is that for the things that we don't know, we simply don't know them. That doesn't give us the justification to then impose state will and state imposition on people who feel that way. We need to not use the state's power to control people's behavior in this way, and really we should just leave it up to a woman and her doctor. And if they deem an abortion is necessary for any reason, by all means, it should be fine. By all means. However, that is not the same as the advice I would give to my friend who is having one. Because let's not forget, in the moral dimension, we need to consider the conscious suffering of the creature who's going to have the abortion. And it can be very, very, especially late ones, they're very psychologically damaging at times. And that shouldn't be not considered, right? Like sometimes going through with the pregnancy might be less damaging psychologically, might have less impact on the mother. And I think that you should have the courage of your convictions to at least be able to talk about that if the mother so wants such advice. If that makes sense. Does the ability to express one's will make something sentient? My phone can't tell me if it cares what happens to it. Data can. Can you explain what you mean by what here and her doctor, what her and her doctor deem necessary? I literally mean it's not my business. Very simple, shaded. Like it's simply at that point not my business. At any point, that mother has more personhood than her fetus. Right now, the rest of society does not recognize that living thing as a person. We can't know for sure if it's sentient or conscious. We know that it can suffer. So there's clearly some consciousness after the nervous system comes online. but it seems to be missing some of the criteria that we would grant necessary for someone to be considered a full person. And so just for a comparison across species that I think makes this kind of clear. If you kill my dog, I don't feel like that you should be guilty of the same crime as murdering a person. But I do feel like my dog has some moral consideration in the society. When does it become sentient? Well, that's the problem, right? And this is what Fred was bringing out. Does the ability to express one's will make something sentient? I'm not sure. You know, I raised several babies myself, and they seem to start to express their will in nonverbal ways pretty early on. But are they also doing that in the womb at any point? We're not sure, right? That's a really difficult question to answer, so we're not sure. But we definitely recognize sentience is necessary. And aren't other beings often more sentient than we sometimes want to think or care for? We live in a society that willingly, kills animals for food all of the time. And, I mean, there are many animals that we're killing that are sometimes seem a lot more sentient than we give them credit for, and definitely have the ability to express their desires. No, brain activity, but that the sentience doesn't follow from the brain activity necessarily, right? Sentience is a step above consciousness. Sentience is self-aware consciousness. There are other conscious systems that aren't conscious enough to the point where either you or I would call it sentience. So we're dealing with competing personhood. There's no doubt the pregnant person is a person. There is room for debate whether the unborn being is. Well, once again, I want to stress my theory and why I think the argument is convincing is because I think you're kidding yourself if you think personhood is an on-off switch. It's not, I am a person, I'm not a person. It's weird to say that some people might be 90, 80, 70% of a person. But we do think this because when someone commits a crime against the society, they surrender some degree of their personhood. We want to take their autonomy away. We want to keep the rest of society safe that haven't violated the society. And so we do put restrictions on them. Now, granted, I'm not trying to get into a debate about justice system and all of that, because maybe you have your feelings on that. But I don't think, I think one that's pretty clear is a serial killer that's clearly deranged. We don't want them freely able to do whatever they want and kill as many people as they want. I don't think anybody would argue that that's a good mode for society. And so why do we justify that, taking that action against them and using the state force against them? Well, because we think, without saying it in the language, that they have surrendered some degree of their personhood through their actions. Now, on the far right, that where they're arguing pro-life and the on-off switch, right? Human being person. In fact, let me share my screen again. It comes back to that exact same website. They have this argument on it. It's really funny to me. Where was it? One of them was about the death penalty. Aren't pro-lifers inconsistent if they support capital punishment? And this website, quick answer, it's wrong to take the life of an innocent human person. So here they admit person, interestingly enough. But the capital offender is not innocent. Therefore, we are morally justified if proven guilty of murder in a court of law and killing them. So in other words, the moment you take the life of somebody else, you surrender all of your personhood altogether, and you deserve the death penalty. I don't agree with that. I agree that maybe that person has surrendered a significant portion of their personhood, and that now justifies the state intervening in their life in a way to keep the rest of us safe. But to say that that somehow justifies me killing that person, no, not so much. I think you got a little bit more work to do in your argument than that. And that comes from this on-off switch, that their belief. So I don't want you to think of competing personhood. It's gradient of personhood. And we should always prefer the more clear person, the one with the most personhood. We should take their desires into consideration more. And back to your original point of expressing your will, that's certainly a way we can all know for sure, right? So that ability to express one's will is part of why we grant a little bit more personhood to our dog pets and a little less personhood to our fish pets. I hope that last point makes some sense. The dog pet, fish pet distinction. Dogs seem to be able to express their will and their desires. My fish doesn't. So I care a lot more about what happens to my dog than my fish. That would also, by their standards and definition, mean every abortion, regardless of reason, should be punished by death. That is what they think, actually. And that is what I thought, David. I never said that because I knew that wasn't politically salient. But I definitely felt that way when I was a pro-lifer, that, like, if only we lived in a just society, these people would be put to death for this action. I'm very ashamed of that fact, that's how I used to think. But I'm hoping in showing through this episode actual convincing arguments and where the real disagreement lies. Because again, I was never convinced by women's rights arguments. I was never convinced by the science arguments. Because you can't science your way out of a moral debate. And this is a moral issue. We're dealing with personhood, and anytime we're dealing with personhood, it's because that is a moral term. Human is a biological term, and all science can tell us is whether or not that thing is a human. It can inform our position on personhood, but it can't actually make the points for us. It can't make the arguments for us because that's philosophy. We've shifted dimensions, and that's what's important about murder is we're talking about human and being. Those are two terms. One's a biological term, one's a moral, philosophical term. And I think a lot of people having this debate don't understand that. Perhaps it would be percentage-based decisions, such as maybe killing someone makes them less than 50% personhood, and a society killing someone makes them less than 50%. Therefore, you're able to take their life. Well, I think anytime we can avoid taking a life or ending one, we should. Straight up. I don't think surrendering someone's personhood, even if they did a heinous thing like mass murder, I don't think we make ourselves any better. Because here's the thing. It comes back to what do we really know right now? And we have to be honest about what we don't know, right? I talked about this in the free will episode, but there's a story of the Texas sniper, bell tower shooter in the 60s. He shot and killed over a dozen people. I can't remember, 16, 17 people. Eventually the cops gunned him down. He had a note that he had left basically that said, if I was ever killed, do an autopsy on me. There's something wrong with me. I keep having these terrible headaches. I have thoughts that I never had at any point before in my life. I feel so violent and angry. Like, please do this. And when we re-examined his autopsy in the 1980s, we discovered that he had a large tumor pressing on his amygdala, known for aggression response and fight or flight. So it's very conceivable that a brain tumor that we could have easily found on an MRI scanner if he had just simply been born at a future time, then we could have done a simple medical procedure and maybe saved the lives of those 17 people. And then if we would have been able to do that for him as a society, he would have never been in the position to do the crime that he was guilty for. If you don't think free will is a thing, which I don't, it really makes no sense to take his life at that point. Now, the reason I say, what won't we know about the future? It could be that in the future, whatever part of our brain, that aggression part that makes us ever want to kill, maybe we have a neutral way to neutralize it. Maybe it's a surgery or a laser, a tapeworm, a fucking pill. I don't know, right? But like, maybe we have that in the future. The moment we learn that in the future, we would go back and look at all of ourselves for all of the death penalties that we would ever do as moral monsters. And so I'm not willing to do it. I don't want my future self to look back on my former self as a monster. If I have the capacity to make the better choice now, I'd rather do that. Not to the conversation to capital punishment too much, but more so to the hypocrisy. If an innocent person is killed by capital punishment, is that not murder? By everyone that supported their wrongful death should be punished by death for killing an innocent person. Yeah, so you're pointing out more contradictions. And it was exactly questions like that, David, that actually started to get me to rethink my position on some of these things. Because when I started to question the existence of souls, I had already accepted that we can't make laws based on souls. Like, it's a secular society, that's fine. But when I started to question, what do I even mean when I say human being? What does it mean to be? What does it mean to have personhood? It started to bring all these other possible contradictions into my thinking. And that's how I landed at the, you know what? I don't know what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to stay out. And then eventually when I cared enough to start to investigate it, Robert kind of questioned this earlier in the chat and was asking, like, 15-year timeline. I think both arguments can get you there on a 15-year timeline. This one is guaranteed to make you ask the right questions. When you dig at the thing of what does it mean to be a person, once again, my experience is that 95% of the people on the left, 95% of people on the right don't know what they're talking about. And by asking tough questions, it's like an itch you have to scratch, right? When you've believed two things that are now in contradiction with each other, number one, that's painful, and so you have to move or you have to figure that out. And you start to dig at it until you find some kind of an answer. And if it's above your head, you'll avoid it. Maybe you'll avoid it for 10 years. Maybe you'll avoid it for the rest of your life. But if you're going to change your mind, that's the process of it. And here's what I want to point out. Think of a single significant thing you change your mind on. I don't mean change your mind like, do you want chocolate or vanilla? I mean, like, are trees good to cut down or bad to cut down? Like something that has consequence, right? No process of changing your mind on that is not done throughout revealing self-contradictory thoughts. It's by pointing out those logical inconsistencies, those fallacies, those things that we think where there's a broken part of our logic. That is actually the only way that we move. And once we know that, we might not know how to solve it, but we want to. Because it's uncomfortable and we want to move. I hope I'm making sense. We got any other questions out there before I wrap up the show tonight? Because this has been awesome. Which, by the way, we can always continue the chat version of this. We can always, hey, what's up? Thanks for coming. We can always, so I stream to 3 platforms, Shaded. And that's probably a little bit of a failure of myself. I stream on Twitch, I stream on Facebook Live, and I stream on YouTube. So I'm multi-streaming to all 3. That's part of why, like, I actually probably could have gotten, like, Twitch, become a Twitch actual streamer a while ago. But then you have to agree to terms not to do that on Twitch, and I don't want to do that. Oh, I kept forgetting that was you, Jeff. What's up, dude? Cyanide. Jeff, whatever. Yeah, and this is what I wanted to stress. These conversations are never good when they're what you see online or even what you see in the cafe or even what you see 90% of the time when people get into it at the family gathering. Most of the time what it is one person's like, but women's rights. And then the other person's like, but human life. Neither of you know what you're talking about. Both of you are just making the problem worse, and we're escalating and we're taking that critical step towards violence and away from harmony, human understanding, mutual coming to a point together where we can actually grow and learn together. I'm hoping through my experience of what moved me from pro-life to pro-choice to the position I have now, I can help both people in the debate. Because maybe I'm wrong. I'm still open to it. And if you're pro-life and you watch this and you're like, I see the self-trickery, the self-deceit you did to avoid your feeling guilty for this heinous belief in these heinous acts of abortion, and here it is. If there was a convincing argument of that, I'm completely open to it. And if you find that flaw in my thinking, please tell me, right? We have to be open to that. We have to be ready to consider that the other side might know something that I don't, or have a belief on this that I don't. I should not be so confident in my science, like many people on the left are. Well, like, the science is on our side on this. Well, the science literally can't be on your side because you can't science your way out of a moral argument. This is a moral problem, not a science problem. Science can inform your moral argument. It can't be your moral argument. You can't just play science here. It's not like that. That card doesn't work. Wrong game. Now, if somebody tells you climate change doesn't exist, just play the science card. They're a fucking idiot. This really is the best, most effective way to discuss this. And we need to discuss this effectively. We cannot afford to, because this is one of those particular disagreements that can start to tear apart the fabric of our society. We already have people in the Texas legislature who want to secede from the union to create to basically make Texas Gilead. And if they got that wish, it would be the first step towards something very dire and something we do not want. We need to get back to being able to have good conversations about this. But when we do that, we gotta be willing to both admit that we're not having a good conversation. We want to have a better one, and let's really know what we're talking about. And actually, that criticism, in my opinion, falls more on the point of the left. Because the left, for political reasons and the ease of ads and the fact that I think culture war type things have become easier to argue this way for the left, it's easy to play that but women's rights man card over and over again and get a lot of cheers from your friends on the left. You get that good bubbly feeling inside, like, oh, I'm doing something good, yeah. And then you're missing the point that they have actually known where their argument is on the side of pro-life for a long time. They're like, dude, I'm still trying to figure out how this thing isn't a person. You have to sow the seeds of doubt about whether or not that thing is a person. There's no other debate to be had. Everything else is a distraction. Everything else is not the conversation they want to have. And you should be able to do that in good faith, respectfully, and understand that your pro-life interlocutor really wants to do good in the world. I thought I was a crusader for justice. I thought I was saving the world of all this baby murder. I really, really did. I 100% believed it. I now know the reason I was wrong is not because I had the wrong intentions. It's because I had the wrong idea of what it means to be a person, what it means to be a human being. And so all of those arguments that got used against me were often ineffective and pointless because they didn't challenge my actual concept of personhood. And the reason why is because most people, there have been multiple people in this chat here tonight who might, they indicate that they're probably a little bit more on the pro-choice side, just from other comments I know from their opinions. They don't know themselves and haven't thought critically about what it means to be a person because it seems obvious. But that's philosophy, baby. Sometimes something that seems obvious really ain't so obvious. And that's the really important point. And so then our ideas change and evolve over time. Hey, really appreciate y'all coming to the chat. This has been a great discussion. Facebook, Twitch, YouTube. If you value this episode, or if you know somebody that's like maybe in the middle of this, or they're having a disagreement with a loved one and they're trying to have a better, healthier conversation, please use this as a platform to do it. I'm going to keep doing these Change My Mind episodes because I think they're really powerful. Yes, I will be there after. Yep, you bet. And what I would really like is for people to go into the Average People Talking Discord, and in the topic suggestions chat channel in there, I would love suggestions of what changed my mind to do next. And if it's useful for people, I can put a list, but pick any random, conservative issue that a typical conservative would have: guns, the economy, taxes, whatever. Hot button issues right now that I probably used to have a different opinion when I was an evangelical Christian. I would love to know what everybody would want to see next. I hope to do it in about 2 weeks. It won't maybe be on Saturday. I'm not committing to a specific day just because with my current schedule, it changes a lot now. I genuinely don't have the flexibility to do that. So it's going to be kind of pop-up announcements when I do these. And I'll put them out everywhere: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all of that. I hope to try and keep it somewhat consistent Friday or Saturday night, but yeah, we'll see. But thank you everybody so much. This has been really fun, and I'm really glad I got to get back to it. I really hope everybody took something away from this that was positive. And, I think this series is going to be really helpful for people. And that's the goal. That's the goal. Have better chats. So once again, thank you so much for coming. And I'm peacing out of here.
What's up? Yeah, it was a good